sports television really champions storytelling.
Welcome to Beyond the Lens, presented by Diesel Films. I am Seth Shapiro.
And I'm AJ Speaks.
On today's show, we welcome Jim Fabio, an extraordinary documentarian who has won multiple Emmy Awards while serving as a colonel in the Air Force Reserve, overseeing the Combat Camera Unit.
Jim tells us about his captivating film titled Orangeburg, a town, a team, and an American tragedy. He walks us through the challenges he had in making and distributing a powerful story about an HBCU in South Carolina. He also talks to us about growing up in Pittsburgh and why he chose to attend the Air Force Academy. Here is Beyond the Lens from Diesel Films.
Jim Fabio, welcome to Beyond the Lens.
Thanks. Good to be here with you guys.
Looking forward to talking to you today. So as you know, we break this podcast into 3 acts, with the first act being your story. Talk a little bit about your upbringing.
Well, grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where by birthright I was made into a Steelers fan back in the 1970s, in the heyday of that franchise. Of course, Seth and I know each other for the audience and for AJ, Seth and I know each other from a project we worked on at the NFL Network, where one of my marquee stories for the project we were working on was about the Immaculate Reception football, right? And so it was a hometown story for me, but one that was rooted in that upbringing in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. If you grew up there, it was hard not to be a fan of the Steelers. And even though I haven't lived in Pittsburgh for a long, long time, that fandom remains, and certainly was a great thing to have as an undercurrent for a lot of the work I do as a freelancer, the NFL and the NFL Network.
Hold on, real quick, hold on.
Yeah.
Don't bury the lead on the Immaculate Reception piece. That piece won the Sports Emmy for Short Feature of the Year, the National Sports Emmy. So let's just, let's bow down to Jim on that one. While we were a team, and there it is. There's a piece of hardware. But while we were a team,
you were saying something about an. Oh.
Hey, while we were a team, there was.
I keep them handy for any podcasts that have a video element to it.
We were a little envious. Of Jim winning the Emmy that year on the Immaculate Reception piece, and now I know that story meant a lot more to you than met the eye. I didn't know you were actually from Pittsburgh.
Yeah, I was super fortunate that that story came along and that it had all the right elements.
Yeah, absolutely. We pushed each other, but then Jim kind of set the gold standard there. We were happy for him.
Hey, Jim, I'm going to tell you this.
Appreciate it. Yeah.
I stayed quiet because I'm a Ravens fan. I'm ready to move on from the Pittsburgh Steelers talk. I just got to put that out there. I'm just listening, but I had to put that out there. I am not a fan of the Steelers, but I'm a fan of your work. So I have a question for you. How did you transition from Pittsburgh to the Air Force Academy and not choose like a traditional university, say UPenn or Penn State or one of those options?
Probably had a lot to do with my upbringing. I didn't come from a military family, but in the 80s, it's the Reagan years. And so much of what we saw coming out of Hollywood was very much patriotic fare. Movies like Red Dawn and Top Gun, Iron Eagle. I mean, we could go on and on. Because of that era, I had this interest in all things Russia and the Soviet Union. This seemed like this evil empire on the other side of the world, and we need you to step forward and do the right thing for the country, the heroic thing. And so I guess I bought into all of that sort of notion, wanted to do something maybe a little bigger and larger than myself. So I decided I wanted to be an Air Force fighter pilot and go to the Air Force Academy. And that ended up working out to go to the Air Force Academy. But while I was there in that very intense military environment, the other side of my nature, my creative self, was looking to continue to have an outlet. And I started dabbling and continuing, I guess, to dabble in filmmaking. When I was in high school, I had played around with VHS and Super 16 Super 8 millimeter film, stop motion stuff, just as a hobby. And I think I had thought, wow, that would be really fun to do, but it seemed much more practical to go become an engineer of some sort and a pilot. And I didn't have a lot of money for college. So a service academy is, if you can get in, your tuition's covered. It's essentially a subsidized education. So it was the right price, and all signs pointed toward that. Little did I know that when I entered that path, 1989, 1990, that by the time I graduated from the Air Force Academy in 1994, we would have gone through the first Gulf War and seen the collapse of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and essentially this big bad enemy of the Soviet Union that had been postured all through my youth as the reason to go be in the military, go away. Our government downsized our military in the early 90s quite a bit. And so, to go through all the pain of going to the Air Force Academy and military school, and for me, that was 5 years because I had a prep school year at another military academy to prepare for the Air Force Academy. So all of that pain and suffering should have paid off in a guaranteed pilot flying school, flight school opportunity at graduation. But because of the downsizing, they had cut those slots back to about 1/3. So it was 1/3 of all graduates medically qualified getting to go to flight school. And my grades, while they were pretty good, they weren't quite good enough to get me into flight school straight out of the academy. So I was looking for something else. And that interest in filmmaking had always been there. And I had started to find some ways to play around again with video production and filmmaking while I was at the academy. And I ended up taking one class that was offered in the English department in TV news production. And the professor was an Air Force major, and he had been in a thing called combat camera. That was his career field. And I asked him about it. And I said, well, if I was to study under you, declare no major, do independent study, would you be my advisor and help me get into that career field? And he said he would, because I had shown some talent for the filmmaking and TV making thing. And I ended up, that's what I did when I commissioned as a second lieutenant and I graduated from the Air Force Academy. The first job I had was at a combat camera squadron in South Carolina, essentially, leading teams of combat photographers and videographers around the world, documenting military operations, and just loved that job. So my real filmmaking career, as a professional, as a college graduate, started with the Air Force. And I stayed on active duty for about 4 years, and then transitioned into the reserves. And at that time, I went to Syracuse University in upstate New York, and I guess got a proper, if you will, film and television degree up there. They have a master's program in television, radio, film there at the Newhouse School at Syracuse. And then from there, jumped to New York, LA, New York, and then eventually back out to California about 15 years ago. And that was about 20 years ago. So I've been freelance in the civilian film and TV biz for about 20 years, and still serve in the Air Force Reserve as a colonel, as a public affairs officer, but still in and around my old combat camera roots with the Air Force. So I've had two simultaneous careers going on for the last 20 years.
And talking about combat camera, which is very interesting. Are those films seen by the public, or is that all top secret footage? Talk a little bit about that, what the footage and what you're trying to create within combat camera.
Much like our lives in the freelance film and TV world, it kind of depends on the job or the operation or what's going on. I would say 90% of what our combat camera teams photograph or film for the military ends up being released publicly and available to the public. There is an online repository of all of that stuff now. When I had originally started back in 1994, we weren't fully digital yet, particularly in video. So we were still shooting videotape. Digital 35 millimeter cameras were just coming on board, but still shooting a lot of film as well. So that repository used to be, a physical building actually in Southern California, where all that stuff eventually made it, and some of it went to the National Archives. But a good majority of it's available now online at a site called DVIDS, Defense Visual Information Distribution Service. It's called, let's see, I'll give you the website if you're interested in it. It's dividshub.net. dividshub.net, and anybody can sign up and create an account, and you can see all of this very cool military footage and photography. And there are some very talented folks serving in uniform who are audiovisual communicators, do some great work.
So the main purpose is marketing?
Not necessarily. I would say every mission that a combat camera team would do would serve the purpose of documenting the operation. So being documentary historians, if you will, sending someone out there to be able to have a visual record of what our military has done. And there are a multitude of reasons that can serve, a multitude of requesters who might ask for a team to go somewhere. And that stems from the operations teams who need to either look at airfields where planes will be flying in from an Air Force perspective. But this is also across the joint community, which is Army, Navy, Air Force, now Space Force, the Marine Corps. Anytime you want eyes on the battlefield or what's going on, that would probably be our team. Although now you have the proliferation of other cameras, and you've got satellites as well. But sometimes there's nothing better for eyes on the ground than a human with a camera, and that's where those combat camera teams come in. We also train them, much like we do in the civilian TV and film business, to be good storytellers, to edit stories out of that. There are news functions within the service. There's AF News, there's Defense Media Activity. These are organizations that create news reports for internal use. So keeping the largest company in the United States, the Department of Defense, the largest employer of any number of people. And I wish I could quote you the number, but it's a big organization. And so disseminating internal information to that group happens through any number of ways, from websites to social media, but also through television news reports, radio news reports, AFRTS, Air Force Radio and Television Service. These are niche and smaller career fields within the military branches, but they're there, and a lot of folks have gotten their start there. Ronald Reagan was in a combat camera unit back in World War II. Jimmy Stewart as well.
It's such an interesting career path that you chose. I too went to Fort Union Military Academy, and then a lot of my classmates went to Service Academy like yourself. I chose Seton Hall University and went that path. But it's interesting how you were able to transition, but still get into sports eventually and do that at the same time. For me, it was one of the best decisions I ever made, going to a military academy. And I think I probably should have kept going the other route that you went. But do you feel that was a wise decision and still impacts all the things you do to this day?
As far as wisdom at any age, I don't know. I hope I have more wisdom now than I had back then. Youthful hubris probably had a lot more to do with going that way. I wanted to be a fighter pilot. It's funny how things change. I knew filmmaking was going to be a thing for me by my junior year, or maybe even entering into it. And so I thought about maybe jumping to a film school at that point. But again, the stability of the paid for education and the job in the Air Force, and when I found out I could do the combat camera career field, I thought that sounds really cool. I'm going to give that a try. How I ended up in sports TV was just a function of, I was in New York City earlier on in my career. I worked primarily as an editor when I jumped out of Syracuse into the business, because back at Combat Camera, we had gotten these Avid systems when they were brand new. And I had at the Air Force Academy, when they were brand new, I was at the Air Force Academy, and I had learned to edit on one of those Avid systems. So when I was in Combat Camera, we got them there as well. And even though I was an officer, I was able to teach some of the enlisted troops how to use them. And so I kept my hand in it. And when I then, at the 4-year mark, did grad school and then jumped into the business, I already knew how to edit on an Avid system. And so as opposed to becoming a PA or some other sort of assistant and working my way in there, I was actually able to jump right into editing. I became a freelance editor, all with the goal of eventually becoming a producer director and taking the creative lead on projects. But for about 5 years, that was my primary job, was as a freelance editor. I got on with a production company on a freelance gig that was doing some great work for ESPN. And the company was called Redline Films, and worked on a high-profile show early in the HD days. There was an HD documentary show called Timeless that was kind of one of their marquee shows, and it got some awards as well. And kind of launched me into sports TV. And I hadn't intended to be a sports television person. But found out, hey, you can make a living in sports television. You know, there are a lot of good outlets here between the multiple sports channels, ESPN, NFL Network, HBO, and others now, Golf Channel. You know, there's just so many outlets, and sports television as an entity really champions storytelling. It still does to this day. We see so much great documentary work within the sports film and television world that it just naturally lent itself toward, okay, if I can tell good stories here, I'm gonna stay here. And I made the jump from New York out to, I live in Santa Barbara, so LA being the closest industry city, that's where I ended up connecting with NFL Network probably about 13, 14 years ago, and how Seth and I met.
Absolutely. And I always tell people that who are trying to break into the industry, what's their best way to get in the industry, easiest route? And I said, learn how to edit. I said, if you know how to edit and you're a good editor, you'll get work. And, I always tell people that. So very similar to me, kind of on that editing side, and then kind of working into, producing and directing. We're going to enter into Act 2 of the podcast, where we're going to focus on one of your fantastic documentary films. Today, we're going to talk about Orangeburg, a town, a team, an American tragedy. The title really just kind of says it all. Talk about this film, how you got involved, how did you find out about the story?
I read about the Orangeburg massacre in the New York Times in 2013. There was a very short story, and I think it was in the sports section. Even after moving out here to California, I still have the New York Times, the paper edition, delivered every day. I just like getting my hands on the paper and reading it. I read the story, and I couldn't believe I had never heard of the Orangeburg massacre. And this was the 45th anniversary of the massacre. And like a good storyteller, I used to keep a folder with a bunch of news clippings, and eventually that transitioned to me. If I read it in the paper, I would download the article online and then put it into a digital folder. And so I have a creative ideas folder on my computer, all organized. Anytime I see a good story, particularly having to do with sports, because that being such a big part of my and our business is working in sports TV. Always looking for good ideas and good stories to pitch. And I thought, this is kind of an amazing story, one that I've never heard of. I've never heard anyone talk about it. And it seems like, too, this is probably an important story if we haven't heard a lot about it. This is one of those, you don't always come across something that people aren't aware of that they probably need to be. So I filed it away. I think I soft pitched it a few times over the years. But then 5 years later, 2018 was coming up, and I realized this is going to be the 50th anniversary. Somewhat akin to trying to tell a World War II story. I was getting a little concerned. We're getting past the point where some of these guys aren't going to be around anymore. I need to find out if this is really viable. And unfortunately, for yet another number of reasons, that story was never really well told, well known. It was kind of swept under the rug. There are a lot of people that didn't forget about it, but certainly as a collective and as the canon of the civil rights movement goes, the Orangeburg massacre was somewhat forgotten. As I looked into it, could this be a sports story? I ended up having to go there for the 50th anniversary. And I had some producing partners originally, one of my buddies from film school and one of his friends, and we took it to ESPN, and ESPN eventually, they looked to be willing to fund it, and they passed, saying it was too political for them, which was a real bummer because I was already down there in South Carolina for the 50th anniversary. And so I paid for, the first shoot myself out of my pocket. But I was so glad I did, because I found these guys who were part of that football team that year. And there were, in fact, a group of them had been involved in the protests. And there were 3 of them I talked to who had been shot and survived. And one of the young men who was shot and died was also a member of the football team. And so I realized, wow, this, we don't come across sports stories like this all that often. And now let's add to that where I'm finding out that this works, but I don't yet have funding. I called our friend Brian Lockhart, who was still at the NFL Network at the time, and said, Brian, I've got this amazing story. I thought we had another network on board, and we don't. And he said, I think there's a way we can make that, which I thought was an awesome move, because we haven't really seen the NFL Network, particularly because they protect the shield, right? They are the NFL. So Seth, I think you and I will probably be able to attest to it. I hadn't found over the years that they were particularly chancy with doing or saying anything that was edgy, if you will, or political. And if ESPN, who does have that sort of reputation, wasn't willing to get behind the film, I wasn't necessarily expecting that. But I thought that was pretty great of Brian to indicate an interest there. So I pressed forward with the project. And the thing to remember, and the way I ended up pitching it in and around that time, was as a backdrop to, 50 years ago, here are Black athletes standing up for what they believe in the face of great odds, and paying a hefty price for it. The members of the college football team joining their fellow students in these protests, putting at risk not only their lives, but they're standing as scholarship holding athletes. I was never a college athlete myself. Well, not one of any import, but I didn't have a scholarship. But I do know that the college athletes aren't particularly eager to do a whole lot that puts something like that in jeopardy. That's the future. That's the livelihood. It's also their sport that they love. But this was a time when there were more important things than football, and these guys were on the right side of history. They were going to take that step out. Fast forward 50 years to this time in 2018, modern day. This was in the wake of when Colin Kaepernick had taken a knee at a football game and multiple football games to make a statement that he did not think what was happening, unfortunately, continues to happen in the United States with regard to police officers shooting Black men, particularly young Black men, at an alarming rate, was right. And that created a lot of stir with our president, and the NFL as a league didn't seem to stand for it at that time. And Colin Kaepernick then paid the price for his advocacy of something that he believed in, and for a cause that he felt it necessary to take a stand against, rather take a knee against. And we saw what happened to him. And so kind of surprised that I was pitching that's where this story ends, is that we talk about that this stuff is still happening 50 years later. There are still young men, young Black men being gunned down by white police officers. And that's why it's important to tell a story about Orangeburg in 1968. That's why it still matters 50 years later. That was the genesis of it. And then finally, through, funding's not always the easiest thing to secure, even with a commitment like that. But we got to the point where we were able to make the film. I did not get to make the longer version that I had wanted to. Ended up being, a half hour, a TV half hour, or without commercials, a 21 minute, 22 minute film. So a short documentary, but.
I'm gonna tell you what, Jim, you articulated very well. You answered like all of our questions. So I'll move past some of that. And I just want to ask you, I was unfamiliar with the story, but it was such a powerful story. But getting these guys to share their story 50 years later, was that painful for them? And then also just working with an HBCU, which tends to be underfunded and don't get as much attention as the other universities. What was that whole experience like?
Let me answer the easier question first, which was working with an HBCU like South Carolina State, who's not incredibly well funded. And it was a little hard getting people on the phone and talking. You call, for any of us who've done work with a college football program, you call the SIO, Sports Information Office, and they're sometimes run as good as pro teams with all of their organization. And these days, an HBCU is struggling for funding and staffing and all of that. So it was a little tough tracking everything down. That's why I went out there, because I realized that for me to really track this down, I'm going to have to go out there. And that's when I met some of the most amazing guys I've ever met in my life, who were... Real quickly,
Jim, let me just interrupt our listeners and filmmakers out there. Did you just show up on the 50th anniversary with cameras, or how did you kind of get your entryway into their trust or credentials or whatever it takes to come down there to start filming the story?
Sure. Sorry. Yeah, I'll back that up. That's an important part of the process. So I made some phone calls just to the school and said, hey, I'm working on this film, and I explained the concept of it and all of that. And it got me to a few people, but I started to realize that, I spoke to the organizers of the event, right, the 50th anniversary committee, and they mentioned a few names here and there. And so I did have a name of a professor, I had a name of a college athlete who had been one of the guys who was shot, but he was not on the football team, but he was on the track team. He was the manager of the football team. Jordan Simmons was his name. Bill Hine, a professor at the school who was kind of the in-house expert on the event, which coincidentally, this professor who's in the film, he's the white guy, the professor who's sitting in the library, if you remember seeing the film. Bill Hine had been at, this was the short version of the film, right? But Bill Hine had been at the Kent State massacre up in Ohio as well, or he was there later after Orangeburg, and it's one of the interesting points, and maybe we talked about this in the film. I can't remember everything that made the cut or not, but I had those two guys, and that was about it. But I needed to get down there. It was just, I should harken back to this because the combat camera side of my story. My combat camera unit that I spent 18 years at, 3 to 4 years on active duty and then 14 more in the reserves, is in Charleston, South Carolina, which isn't but like an hour and 15 minutes from Orangeburg. When I was doing some of my initial flight training to try to get into pilot training once I was on active duty, I used to fly in and out of their airport and do touch and goes from Charleston back. So I knew Orangeburg, and that had emphasized to me, AJ, like you, how could I not have heard about this? I lived there for a long time. How can something like this just be not known? It seems so fundamentally important. But, South Carolina didn't, whomever there didn't, they weren't wearing that on their shirt sleeve. It was, people wanted that story to go. And so it seemed like I needed to go down there anyway. And I'm glad I did to the 50th. And I had said, hey, I'm going to bring a couple cameras, but I didn't have a funding commitment at that point. I knew I was out of pocket. So I called in a couple favors, brought in a crew from Atlanta that I'd known and worked with. And I said, can you help me out, for a little bit less than normal? And that guy brought his son who does some drone work. And so some of the stuff that you even see in the final film, we did shoot that very first time, but most of the interviews and most of the footage in the game was much later. Shot it over the course of maybe a year and a half. But those initial clearances, normally I'm not going to spend money or show up somewhere, particularly like on a more professionally budgeted something that's directly for a network coming from them, unless I know I have it all buttoned up. I try to shoot as few days as possible. And on this, it was one of those where I kind of knew I had to go. So I was there for the 50th, and Jordan Simmons introduced me to his buddy, Jackie Kennerly. And here we are 50 years later, talking to these guys as a white man, talking to these older Black gentlemen who have been through an experience like this, but it's not just that one time experience. They had lived their lives under the thumb of a system of systemic racism, where not only are you living through that, but you live through this moment where you're shot, you almost die, your town treats you like they don't really care too much that this has happened. The story is swept under the rug, and then nobody knows about it. So I think on one hand, they were grateful that somebody wanted to come tell the story, and there was a PBS documentary done a few years ago, but once again, probably didn't get the attention it deserved. I don't know if enough people saw my film, but it was on national and it's out there. But I think we need to keep telling a story. That's how we keep this alive. These guys didn't get justice, right? Jackie Kennerly, Dr. Cleveland Sellers, one of my personal heroes in life now, who was the man behind so many men, from Stokely Carmichael to Dr. King himself. He was there and one of the kindest and most gracious human beings I'll ever meet, let me come in and ask these questions. And they gave it all. I think on one hand, grateful that someone's here to help us continue to tell the story. Maybe that's some justice when the legal system provided none and still hasn't, but also with great pain because it brings up those memories of things. AJ, Jackie said to me, I couldn't talk about this until about 10 years ago, and I wouldn't have. It took him 40 years. Jackie, after he got shot and recovered, he got to go to Bengals training camp. He had an opportunity there, but then he got drafted into the Army and was shipped off to Vietnam. Wasn't able to get around the draft like maybe others of more privilege were able to. I won't mention anyone's name or indict anyone in that, but I think we all know that, there were ways around that, but Jackie didn't have that benefit. So it was a bit of a 1-2 punch for him. The Vietnam War was tough. Jackie carries those scars. And I think it's a dual-edged sword for guys like this telling their story. On one hand, yes, I want and need for this to be out there. Society needs to understand and hopefully learn and grow. Folks who don't know the story need to know it. But at the same time, just like any traumatic thing that happens in one's life, it stirred it all up. And I could see that these guys, it was tough. And I am grateful to them for helping me to gather and tell their story, hopefully in a way that is educational and informative, but powerful and transformative. It was for me, absolutely. And I hope for folks who see the film that it is as well. And the sport of it and the team is just the backdrop. But those guys are great. They have a group email that they send around. We're not all that young, but the youngers than us, it's a group text, right? So these guys send out a group email. I'm on that email, which is, so I get all this stuff back and forth. That team is tight. It was the team in the fall of 67 that was then, so many of them, that was their senior year, some of them their junior year. That was that South Carolina State Bulldogs team, and they're still a pretty tight group. And it's an honor and one of the privileges of my life to be included in so much of what's going on with that group when they talk to each other.
And I think one of the goals of this podcast is to shine a light on these fabulous stories and documentaries that maybe people haven't seen, but we want to, point them in that direction to make sure that they're watching these stories to understand that injustices have been happening, for the last, for the history of this country. I have to ask, the archive footage I thought was unbelievable. I thought it was uncanny. You had shots of the bowling alley. You had shots of the bowling alley owner. I really thought the archive footage was impressive. Talk to me about how you found all the archive footage, where it was, how'd you unearth it? Sometimes that can be the difference between bringing, a film home or not having that footage.
Absolutely. The original concept of the film was to do some reenactments as well, which is really, we see that so much these days, right? If you don't, you're sort of like not using a gimbal or not using a drone now. If that camera's not moving, you're from the previous era. But when the film got shorter and the funding got smaller, that was kind of what went. And I did lean on that footage and photographs. Just tracking it down. There was a researcher, Rich Remsburg, and he had worked on that PBS documentary. And so I got his name, called him, and he put me onto a lot of sources, ABC, NBC, the news outlets in New York, who provided so much of that. University of South Carolina has a library, and they have a heavy amount of archive footage there. So much came from there as well. And Columbia, South Carolina news station had some footage as well. I'm sure there was more out there that I didn't find. I was doing most of that tracking down and acquiring the footage myself. I didn't have an archival producer, which would have helped. I think if you've got the budget, that's the way to go, because finding archive footage is a very specialty function in the biz. That
absolutely,
who's the best at that? Ken Burns, right? Like in that team, those guys, that's why we watch, because Ken Burns doesn't do a whole lot of the fancy reenactments, all that, but I can still watch 13 hours of whatever. It's always the same motif, the slow pan on the old photos, all that, but they find it all and they research it all and they bring it out. And when you're talking historical, that's the difference between bringing it to life or it just being sort of anecdotal, I think. And so, yeah, I was shocked that there was footage of the bonfire and the night of, and there were photographs of those state troopers on the hillside, right before they opened fire.
And I know as a filmmaker, and I just know as a filmmaker, when you find that stuff, it's like finding gold. I mean, it's a great feeling.
Yeah, and I edited the film myself too, and so that process felt very like I needed it right in there, and I went through it. Yeah, AJ, you were asking.
I had a question for you. Did you try to get any of the state patrol or the judges or anybody on that other side of that fence of that story? What happened with that?
It's a great question. I looked into that side of the story, and because of the short time I ended up with to tell it, if I'd have had the hour or the 90 minutes that I'd originally wanted, absolutely I would have. It was my understanding that there may have been one of the state troopers who was still around, still alive. I had seen an interview with one of those guys from like 10 years earlier, talking about explaining it. And in several of the books that had been written, I saw some explanation for what may have set that up. Ultimately, I realized in the short amount of time, I kind of just wanted to let the guys tell their story and let us live it through their eyes and their experience. But I did try to make sure I was doing my due diligence and adhering to what Stephen Colbert calls truthiness, if not, the spirit of what had happened. I wanted to make sure that, these guys aren't saying something that is commonly a misconception about the event, or that from the law enforcement side of it, there were these things. I mean, there were any number of stories that came out in the paper the next day, like that the students were opening fire on the police officers and such. The only real piece of the truth, at least as it's reported from several sources, that I didn't so much include in there that would have been an interesting, I think, piece of information, is that some of the students were throwing pieces of wood. There was an old house that was abandoned right off to the side of where all this went down, and they had pulled wood from the porch for the bonfire and that had been going, and someone threw a railing from that porch and it hit a police officer right on the bridge of the nose, and he started gushing blood. And in the dark and in the confusion, the story is that the word got around to the police officers on the side of the hill there that somebody had been shot, that one of their colleagues had been shot, which is no excuse for what happened, but may have that may have built that tension and given them more hair trigger fingers than they would have otherwise had. My response to that is, then maybe that's why you don't run around with guns in the middle of the night where there's not good lighting, So it's in no way trying to say that we're excusing these guys. I mean, my filmmaker's choice was, I've got these guys. They've survived this awful thing. I want them to tell me their story.
For everybody out there, we're going to link this film in the description. Of course, we highly recommend watching this film. And, we wonder if, progress, has really been made, with what's going on today. Act 3, we're going to get some quick hitters. AJ, why don't you start us off?
Jim, just to echo Seth's point, I think the film just needs more attention. It's just one of those films that really needs a lot more attention. But I just feel a lot of relation to some of the things that you said throughout this whole podcast. You know, for myself, I saw A Few Good Men before I went to military school. It scared the heck out of me. But it was like you said, at that time, those were the types of movies that we were seeing as kids. So what is your favorite sports documentary?
Oh, my favorite sports documentary. I really like the Vic documentary that was just done this year. And I saw him a couple days ago at this NFL shoot we did, and I did a story on him a while back for the NFL. But I liked how it went deep on a story that I knew a lot about, and I thought he really opened up in that. And I told him as much on Saturday. It's one of the good docs of this year. I'll tell you, Jason Hare's The Last Dance, and Jason's another friend of mine and part of the sports documentary community, and he's just done some great work for 30 over the years, but he nailed it on The Last Dance. I think it was episode 7 finished up, and I was watching it on a plane, and I landed and I said, "You got me, man." I forget what happened at the end of episode 7, but I was like, "Nicely done." I texted.
It was a little Pearl Jam
there. You should get Jay. You want Jay? You guys want to get Jason on here?
We'd love to get Jason on here.
Yeah. Well, I'll reach out. Well,
you keep answering all of our questions. That was one of the things we were going to ask you. You just keep going.
For someone out there who wants to make a documentary film, what's the one piece of advice you'd give them?
Oof, the one piece of advice. Jim, don't say a lot. Just say one.
Quick hitters.
Do it. Start capturing the story and figuring out what it's going to take to put it together. If it's something you want to do it. Life's short. Every day that goes by is one less day to achieve your goals and dreams. So I'm holding up an iPhone for the listeners at home. If you've got one of these and you've got a computer, heck, you can probably do it on here. Start shooting something, but watch documentaries. I learned how to play tennis by watching Andre Agassi play tennis on television back in the 80s, and I tried to be like him. I'm not a very good tennis player, mind you, but watch documentaries, start telling stories.
What's one documentary or something that's in your folder? You told us about the folder that you have. What's in there that you really want to tell? Is there another story, or is there something else outside of it that you really want to tell that you haven't been able to tell yet?
Orangeburg was the one that I really had to tell, and I'm just grateful that I got to tell it in some form thus far. Orangeburg is the story I still want to tell because there are more nuances and aspects to it. I'm working with loosely, but there's some colleagues I've met through South Carolina State who are down in Hollywood and are trying to work on a scripted version. So not documentary, it's scripted. Dr. Cleveland Sellers, who I met through the Orangeburg film, has an amazing life story. And Orangeburg is just the kind of end of his civil rights era journey. And I would like to tell his story at some point through a documentary, maybe also through a scripted project. So those are on my mind. I think getting Orangeburg made and done and in the form that even you saw was one of the truly the definition of that labor of love or just a passion project. And I haven't had anything as important to say since I was able to gather and tell that story.
That's
awesome.
awesome.
It's such a miss for ESPN. Like they missed the boat. Like this seems like it could have been a Disney movie. It seems like there's so many layers to this story that they could have told, and they just missed the boat. I mean to cut you off, Seth, but that just popped in my head.
I agree, AJ. I it's not because I think highly of myself. I just thought, how can I keep telling people about this story? And I put together a great treatment with a lot of historic photos in it and everything. And they'd be like, yeah, I don't know. I just don't. I'm like, oh, what do you not know? And in the current environment in which we're living, with Black Lives Matter and everything that's going on, how does this not hit you right here? And how can you not say, yeah, we not only do we want to tell this story, let's do it the right way. But I'm just happy that first step has been taken, and I'm hoping that there are more ways to continue to tell these guys' story.
Definitely. It seems like the timing might have been a little off for them for this pitch, where now, they're kind of putting a little bit more energy into these type of stories. But that's a whole nother podcast about pitching.
Yes. Yeah.
But Jim, we appreciate your time. You gave us some outstanding stuff. And is there anything you want to promote, or where can our listeners find you if they have any questions, if they want to contact you for any advice?
On Saturday, we did a shoot for with Rich Eisen for Run Rich Run, his annual fundraiser for St. Jude. And this year, instead of it just being Rich running the 40, we've got some donors, some well-heeled donors, entrepreneur types, titans of industry who came and partnered up with legends of the NFL game, to include Mike Vick, who I had mentioned earlier, and Ray Lewis, Jerry Rice, Chris Carter. And they teamed up, and everybody ran the 40 and raised, and donated money and raised money, and for the kids at St. Jude. And that story will air during Rich's broadcast of draft.
Was Vic still fast?
That information is embargoed, but let's just say he's in fine form. You'll have to tune in on the 29th to see how everybody did. Although NFL.com will be putting out stuff on social at some point soon. But nice. Those elite athletes, they are pretty amazing. How some of those guys look like they could still suit up and get right back out there, but I'm sure they probably don't want to. Nobody wants to take the hits anymore. So
that's awesome.
Good of them to come out.
We'll be looking out for it, Jim. We'll be looking out for it coming this draft in a couple weeks. And again, thanks for everything. And we are wrapped. A big thank you to Jim Fabio, a prolific storyteller in the nonfiction space. Please subscribe, rate, and review the show. And if you do, we will shout you out as one of our MVP listeners. We'll be back next week with another great episode of Beyond the Lens. And that's a wrap. And I'd like to give a special thanks to our editors, Jacob Gorenberg and Andrew Holman, and our production assistant, Candace Evans.